Hi, I'm Cameron.
And I'm Hayden.
And this is
Until the End of Crime. Cameron, I need you to go on an adventure with me.
You need to know, like Enrique Iglesias.
Okay, you co-signed it.
Listen back, baby. It was not a confident yes. It was a let's
Ew,
move forward.
Okay, doesn't matter. It was, you still acquiesced. You said, yes, Enrique, you are just as culpable as I am.
You're right. I did. I agreed with you. I yesed your Enrique Iglesias, Mark Anthony mix-up.
And that's what knocked you off your game. You've never so willingly agreed with me. My apologies to Mark Anthony. My apologies to Enrique Iglesias. My apologies to the listeners.
Particularly the millennials.
Yeah, I don't know what I was thinking. So this adventure you're going on with me, we're hopping in a time machine, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And we're traveling back to 1986. We've arrived in the New Brunswick province.
Are we not doing the
of
question?
Canada.
Are we skipping the question?
I'm getting to the question. Oh my God.
I thought you were just diving right into your vignette.
No, I said no vignette for today. 1986, New Brunswick province, Canada. How do you think people are getting their news?
Well, I was going to say carrier pigeon, but because it's Canada, that feels offensive somehow.
It is offensive somehow.
Isn't it?
I don't know why. It's
I
like you
don't
think
either.
Canadians are backwards. I don't know if you hear that in Saskatchewan.
I
but
definitely don't. You're the one who's delivered Canadian hate on this very podcast.
I have never delivered Canadian hate.
You had to apologize.
Roll the tapes. I love Canada. So I don't believe that. I can't believe I would ever say anything bad about Canada. I would love to live there.
I'm pulling the raw
think
audio.
it is beautiful and gorgeous and wonderful.
And it looks like Linda Evangelista.
Yeah, I don't care if it gets super cold there, even though I'm not built for that. Don't let Cameron try to change your perception of me, Canada. Her and her carrier pigeon theory.
I'm going to roll that beautiful bean footage of you saying negative things about Canada and then having to apologize because you said, I want to come live there. Please forgive me.
You know what? If I said anything negative about Canada, I think it was that their maximum penalty for murder is life in prison. And then you get an opportunity for parole at 25 years in.
But before you pressed record, you couldn't stop talking about how stupid they were for not agreeing to be the 51st through the 58th state.
That is absolutely false. That is almost enraging. No, that is not true. Don't get me started on the things you say about your actual home country, about the UK. I'll let all of our UK listeners know what you really think. She thinks you're all slobs that worship a king, a monarchy.
I was like, what is he about
and
to
that you
say?
Drink nasty tea.
He's saying all of the things that he says when we're not recording.
That might be a little true about the UK. Mm-hmm. But I have not said those nasty things about Canada. Anyways, aside from carrier pigeon, how do you think Canadians got their news?
Definitely newspapers and TV.
Newspaper, periodicals, TV, the radio. So yeah, much like the rest of the Western world at that time, news was dispersed via periodicals. Today's case relies heavily on newspaper journalism and the people who create that journalism. Rick McLean, former editor of the Miramichi Leader, is quoted as saying, "I told my wife, he's in a maximum security prison. He's not getting out. What I didn't tell her was, if he does get out, we'll have to run. We won't have a choice." Rick McLean's words were nearly prophetic. At the time, McLean was simply going about his job, covering local crime, writing headlines, and reporting facts to the people of the Miramichi region. But the story that he was covering would not stay confined to the printed page. It would bleed into the very streets of Miramichi, creeping closer to the reporters who chronicled it, reminding them that in a small town, there is no true separation between the news and the people who make it. Miramichi, New Brunswick, sits at the mouth of the Miramichi River in northern New Brunswick. By census, it's the largest city in the region, though its population barely reaches 17,000. The roads are modest, lined with unassuming storefronts and quiet homes. The river's wide expanse dominates the local landscape. For much of its history, this place was actually a scattering of smaller communities: Newcastle, Chatham, Douglastown, Logieville, Nelson, and other smaller service districts, including Norden, Moorfield, Chatham Head, and Douglas Field. I'm not actually sure what a service district is. I don't know if you have any idea.
I do not.
Okay, me either. I didn't allow myself to get that swept up in learning more about the formation of Miramichi.
Service district?
Service districts.
Would that just be the same as like district? And they say service district because that's the area that is served within that district?
In my mind, I was thinking them as more of like smaller outlier communities, kind of like Ray Point is Three Rivers, but it's just an area that's less populated. I have no idea. It could be exactly what you're talking about. I don't know. Until 1992, all of these communities I just mentioned existed as their own distinct entity, with its own sense of identity. The provincial government's municipal reorganization, which is really kind of just a euphemism for a forced merger that took place without public vote or open debate, is what created the community of Miramichi. At the time, Premier Frank McKenna, also the MLA for Chatham, appeared to be at the center of this decision. There were several locals who suspected that Frank McKenna had personal reasons, personal motivation for centralizing the power of Miramichi and consolidating influence. And there were several community members that did not think of this as a unifying move. I do want to point out, though, that it seemed to be kind of like a national push by Canada to do this municipal reorganization to strengthen commerce across the country. So by taking these smaller communities and merging them into one, I think the idea is that would improve industry. But it did leave several Canadians, especially from this area, very upset. By 1995, the merged entity was officially recognized as the city of Miramichi, and I do want to point out that even though most of these townspeople were upset, they seemed to adapt over time. However, those old identities never fully disappeared, so it was common for Newcastle residents to refer to their neighborhood by its historic name, as did those from Chatham and elsewhere. The reason I bring that up is because the story I'm telling you today is going to be told from the perspective of post-1995 Miramichi. So all of those smaller municipalities grouped into a larger municipality. And if I say Miramichi, just know that I'm talking about a pretty large region, but I might also refer to it as Chatham or other various names, but just know that it's all Miramichi.
So kind of like a county.
Kind of.
Where it's made up of other communities.
In the Miramichi region, there was no real pattern of crime. Neighbors trusted neighbors. There was a sense of security. Like we've talked about before, maybe not everyone locked their doors. All of that was until 1986, when tragedy struck the Glendinning home, shattering those illusions of small-town security. The Miramichi Leader was not just any local paper. It was the paper. The Miramichi Leader was founded in 1976 by David Cadogan, or Cadogan, and his father. And I say founded, but really it had been the North Shore Leader from 1906 to 1978. But in 1976, David Cadogan and his father purchased it and then changed it to the Miramichi Leader. Of course, there is some kind of overlap in the reporting for what the name of it was when. For our purposes, I will just be referring to this paper as the Miramichi Leader throughout the story. So, the Miramichi Leader cataloged everything from the mundane to the monumental. City council debates, lost pets, weekend events, and occasionally criminal proceedings that rattled the community. Most weeks, the front page covered stories that felt safe and predictable. But even in a small town, the smallest story can spark big emotion. And it really makes me think of how my grandmother wrote for our local newspaper for so many decades. And the article she wrote was titled News from Ray Point. And it was essentially what my family had done that week. And then what other people in the Ray Point community had done that week.
Are there other people who are not Your family living in the Ray Point community?
Yeah, absolutely. Might they somehow be related to me? Sure.
I lived there at one point, so I guess that is true.
Yeah. You might have even made the Ray Point news.
I don't think so.
I don't know. My grandma would slip stuff in there. I remember my dad would get so irritated. He'd be like, why did you need to report that in the news? Why did you need to share exactly what I did on what day? And it was so funny. And I spent so many Sunday afternoons. My grandmother would make her phone calls. She would call all of these different people in the community and ask what they had done that week. And they would tell her, and she would write it down. And then her arthritis had gotten bad. And so she would have me type up her news for her. And I would be like, wow, this is going to get printed. And I wish I had valued it more, because now in hindsight, I think it was a really cool thing that she did and got to do. But all of that to say is that small, banal things can be really important in small town community news, especially in the 1980s. Enter Rick McLean. Rick McLean stepped into the office of the Miramichi leader just looking for employment. I believe he had actually been recommended by an employment finding agency called Manpower Canada after Cadigan had visited and shared that he was looking for someone he could train to be a reporter. According to McLean, the greeting that Cadigan offered him was anything but polished. And he said, "Who the fuck are you?" Yet within 15 minutes, McLean was hired. And pretty soon after, he was actually running the newsroom. Cadogan remembers thinking that McLean had an edge, almost kind of like a predatory instinct for a headline, for a story. And through Cadogan's prompting, I'm sorry, I want to say Cadigan because that's how it looks phonetically. But when I was listening to it, like when I watched this episode of John Carpenter's Suburban Screams, it was like Cadogan. Through Cadogan's prompting and McLean's natural disposition.
Take a shot every time Hayden changes up the pronunciation.
These two and their combined approaches really led to the Miramichi leader becoming more than just a stack of local fish wrap. It demanded to be read. There were times when McLean's reporting clashed with some in the community, and it was not unusual for them to receive letters. And supposedly, one particularly agitated reader once mailed in a letter declaring that they wanted to use McLean's testicles as golf balls. Now, how accurate that is, I can't say for sure. McLean really believed in the power of journalism and its ability to shape conversations. And in a place where major crimes were few, he made the most out of every story he could get. Still, even he could not foresee the horror that would soon dominate the headlines. John and Mary Glendinning were ordinary, well-respected residents of the Miramichi area. They were the kind of people whose names might appear in the paper for some kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Charitable or social event, but not for any kind of crime. Then, one night in 1986, the unthinkable happened. Someone,
they ended up in the paper for a crime,
later identified as Allan Legere, broke into their home.
The names, Glendinning and Legere.
Cadogan.
Yeah.
The encounter escalated with shocking brutality. John Glendinning was beaten mercilessly. His body was subjected to blow after blow in what can only be described as this prolonged methodical attack. By the time the assailant fled, John was beyond help. His injuries were too severe. Mary Glendinning had also been attacked, sexually assaulted, beaten about the head, sustaining injuries that all logic should have proven to be fatal. Yet somehow she survived. And after the intruder disappeared into the darkness, Mary managed to call 911. And there's an actual clip of this 911 call, or at least the transcript. And you can hear the confusion in Mary's voice. It's like she understands that she and her husband are in trouble, but obviously the shock of having some kind of horrific terror just occur. And she is able to communicate that she thinks that Legere has left their home and that she's almost sure that her husband has been killed and that he very easily could have killed her, that she might die still from her injuries. Mary was trapped upstairs, unable to move freely to check on John. When police were able to reach Mary in the hospital, because she did make it to the hospital, she was able to name Allan Legere as the man that was in her home in Miramichi. And one of the things that Rick McLean was so able to capture is that the people of Miramichi and Cadogan himself, they were both able to capture that people of the Miramichi area were familiar with Allan Legere. He wasn't someone who was under the radar. He had a large physical stature, and it seemed like for most of his life in Miramichi, he was more than willing to use that to intimidate people. He also had known and observed acts of animal cruelty under his belt. And so there were lots of instances where people knew that something was not right with Allan Legere. So identifying him was not difficult. Better yet, Allan Legere was arrested within 3 days of the assault, of the murder. And the town of Miramichi was relieved. For 3 days, they lived in terror as to where Allan Legere was. And as that case moved through the courts, the local papers, including the Miramichi Leader, all of the details and opinions about Allan Legere were published as well. The trial ended with a conviction, and Legere was sent to a maximum security facility. And as far as anyone knew at that time, that was the end.
I was about to say a complete list of sources and any links. Sounds like we've wrapped this up.
No, well,
tip of the iceberg.
It's so crazy because Rick McLean and Cadogan both talked about how they wrote columns where they really kind of lambasted the character of Allan Legere, and rightfully so. And one of the things that came to surface is that during this time, when he was being first tried, he was really, really upset with Rick. And I didn't include this because I was like, oh, is it important? But he was really upset with how Rick McLean and Cadogan painted him. He said that they turned the community against him. And it sounded like there was a level of wanting revenge. He felt that he had been treated unjustly by them through the paper.
After he
murdered, sexually assaulted, robbed.
Should we be painting these people who commit these acts in a positive light on this podcast? According to this guy?
I don't know. Sometimes you do.
Shut the fuck up.
I also didn't include this part. God, there are so many parts I should have included. He didn't just attack them. The whole time he's attacking Mary Glendinning, he's beating her, sexually assaulting her, but also saying he wants the combination to their safe. And Mary is trying to open the safe, and he's still beating the shit out of her while she's trying to open the safe. And then she can't open the safe because she's so rattled and fucked up from getting hit in the head. Messy, dumb, evil man. I don't know how he wanted to be painted.
It doesn't make sense.
No, it sure doesn't.
And I think that's the point you were trying to make.
Yeah. We're going to fast forward. May 3rd, 1989.
I knew it was going to be 89.
So roughly 3 years later, an innocuous radio transmission crackled outside Dr. George L. Dumont Hospital in Moncton at 10:31 a.m. Atlantic Institution guard Doug Sweezy relayed that prisoner transport had arrived, confirming the identity of the inmate, Allan Legere. Legere was escorted by guards Bob Hazlett and Robert Winters, the official story being that he required treatment for an ear infection. Yet, this was no ordinary medical complaint. For weeks, Legere had been deliberately aggravating his inner ear, poking and scraping it until a severe infection formed. It was a self-inflicted wound, engineered as the first step in a meticulously planned escape. Inside the hotel, the guards led him down sterile corridors to an examination room, and at some point, Legere requested to use the restroom, claiming he needed privacy to defecate. Now, if you know anything, prisoners aren't really allowed privacy, especially not in spaces like this. But because it was a more clinical setting, it seems that his current guard, while he was defecating, was giving him some level of privacy, but was still in the room with him. And as Legere evacuated,
his bowels.
He said, "Oh, I need toilet paper." The guard steps out briefly to grab toilet paper. And in that time period, Legere, and sources do differ a little bit here, but I'm going to give you both, so don't worry.
No, you're going to give me the most entertaining version.
In this brief window of time, Legere, from his rectum, pulls out some kind of rudimentary handcuff key that he crafted out of materials that he had found around the prison. Another source kind of points to he pulled out a collapsed TV antenna from his rectum, along with a separate metal shard of some kind that had been hidden inside of a cigar. And so I think that one version fits within the other version. I think that it could have been a TV antenna and a separate metal piece hidden in a cigar, but the first version didn't have the information about the cigar. So for our purposes, I'm going to say that we had at least 2 different metal pieces that came in through his rectum.
That does seem the most accurate, right? When you think of a handcuff key.
Yeah, but he created this fucking makeshift key out of what? I don't know. I don't know what piece of metal he could have found.
Out of a TV antenna and a shard.
Right, but the antenna was its own thing, I think.
I like that it's a shard and that it came out of his rectum and then it's close to shart.
Stupid.
I just enjoy that.
I love that all of it comes out of his rectum because the dedication. This man says, I'm going to give myself an ear infection, which awful. I hate ear infections. Have you had an ear infection as an adult?
Oh, no.
Yeah.
No, I'm a grown up.
Okay. Well, they suck.
They do suck.
I had one when I think was like 27.
I used to get like chronic swimmer's ear.
Ugh. Yeah, it's rough. It's so painful.
Mm-hmm.
And so to know that he was going in and scraping his ear, hoping to produce like a bacterial infection.
But there's yet another experience that I cannot particularly relate to is being in prison and trying to create an extreme situation in which I escape said imprisonment. So desperate times, my friend.
Yeah, there's a lot of situations we can't relate to, thankfully. Neither one of us can relate to murder.
Which means that I don't know if I could relate to sticking something up my rectum in order to escape the situation.
Legere was not lacking in creativity or desire. He came up with the plan and he executed that bitch. Legere used whatever tool, whatever it was, and he actually used that to free himself from his handcuffs first and then his leg shackles.
Your hands, look, I was raised by a quadriplegic, and let me tell you, he will tell you, hands over legs any day. So, yeah, you want your hands freed before your legs. I'm just saying.
I'm glad your dad shared that experience with you.
Well, when your dad's quadriplegic, you ask questions when you're growing up like, what would happen if they came up with some sort of scientific breakthrough that would make you be able to walk again? And he's like, I don't particularly care about being able to walk again because my bones would not be able to handle it after all these years. They would just snap. But he was like, but if I could have the full use of my hands back, that would be a game changer.
Yeah. Oh, Lord. I can't imagine not being able to use my hands.
I can imagine it.
Even I don't think I can fully understand. So Legere freed himself from his cuffs, then his leg shackles. He did leave his body belt fastened, so at a casual glance, he might have still appeared restrained. How are you wiping your ass with handcuffs on?
You reach down between.
Oh, God. Not back to front.
No, you can reach down between and go front to back. You just
that also seems gross. Doing it from underneath with fucking balls. Are you kidding me? Who wants to be doing all that?
Now, an experience that I can't particularly relate to is having the testicles in the way.
People who wipe from between their legs. Is that common? That can't be the most common way. Like if you've taken a shit.
Probably not the most common way.
Right. Probably not, right?
Yeah.
I just feel like that's an infection waiting to happen, especially for women. Men, you're just getting fucking dingleberries everywhere.
I don't think that just because you're wiping between your legs that means that you're creating an infection. I don't even know what this conversation is.
I don't know. It just seems dangerous.
Why.
Anyway, so
we went from TV antennas up your butt to I don't even know.
When guard Robert Winters returned to check on Legere.
To check on him? I thought he was getting TP.
Well, sure, to bring him his toilet paper back. What the fuck ever. Legere emerged armed with a sharpened metal weapon, one of those things from his rectum. And again, sources differ a little bit. Some say that that metal piece that he used to undo his shackles and cuffs was also kind of a crude blade, but others say that he had a separate knife-like implement, possibly fashioned from that collapsible antenna. Either way, it's the same two pieces of metal, but which one he used, I'm not sure. A second security officer tried to halt him using pepper spray, but the irritant seemingly had no effect. Adrenaline tolerance, psychological dissociation, I don't know, but he was managed to run out of the hospital and into the parking lot without consequence, without being caught. When Legere made it to the hospital parking lot, he spotted hospital employee Peggy Olive. She had just stepped outside when he seized her. She felt the cold press of metal, that improvised blade, against her body. In a breathless instant, he demanded her car keys and forced her into the vehicle. I'm not sure if they traveled at all with Peggy still in the vehicle, but if he did, very quickly he pushed her out and didn't do her any real harm other than carjacking her and traumatizing her.
So he's in prison for killing Glendenning because it was just the husband who passed, right?
He had a, lifetime in prison sentence for second-degree murder, which put his first parole opportunity at 12 years into a sentence.
And then did he have any additional sentencing for the attack and assault on Mrs. Glendenning?
I'm not sure.
Do we know why he was in the Glendenning home to begin with?
Well, I think that their first initial thought was that it was a robbery gone wrong.
Very wrong.
But the fact that he sexually assaulted Mrs. Glendenning, killed Mr. Glendenning, also beat her, I think it was, I'm not sure about all of that information just because it doesn't end up being necessarily the focus of the case.
I'm trying to understand psychologically where he's coming from.
Right.
So I feel like if I better understood the motive behind that, I would better understand maybe the rest of this.
I don't know if the motive was ever very clear. It said that
That's my concern.
Yeah, that he wanted to rob them. Older couple, assumably had cash on hand, but it doesn't seem like that ended up being what he really wanted, or at least it wasn't once he got inside.
He probably wanted to exert his power and dominance. Mm-hmm. It sounds like that's kind of what he's doing, even in this hospital situation. I'm going to outsmart you. I'm going to dictate that I go to the hospital because I am going to create an infection that will force you to take me there. Even in that, there is a power dynamic that he is perceiving and probably reveling in some, even in the way that he's escaping.
And if you take into consideration what he was like as a youth, physically intimidating people with his stature, animal cruelty. Animals. So whereas Legere let Peggy Olive go almost immediately, no one has ever been able to quite pin down why he did so. It wasn't really necessarily his style to let someone go like that, but it's believed that he might have thought that having a hostage would slow him down.
It could distract him if he's having to split his focus between what's going on in the rearview mirror and what's going on in the passenger seat or in the back seat.
Yeah, I think either way that would slow him down.
Yeah, it would cause him to be more prone to make mistakes.
Whatever it was, he needed Peggy Olive out of the car, and Legere sped off to the east, heading to the one place he really wanted to be, Miramichi.
To wreak havoc on the town after they painted him out to be exactly who he is.
Pretty much.
Party.
For 4 days, no one could confirm Legere's whereabouts. He vanished into the dense forest of the Miramichi region, and it's believed that he traveled kind of the winding roads and the foresty pockets along that Miramichi River, stealing supplies and using backwoods knowledge to evade law enforcement. And naturally, this set the community on edge. Anxiety rippled throughout each of the different smaller municipalities. On May 7th, 1989, Legere announced his presence once more. Sometime that evening, Legere abandoned the car he had stolen from Peggy Olive. He found a new vehicle belonging to Max Ramsey in Newcastle, and with sudden violence, Legere overpowered Ramsey, beating him, tying him up, and robbing him. Ramsey's wallet was later discovered in Newcastle, discarded. Far more valuable to Legere was Ramsey's 1986 Chrysler New Yorker. With this new sense of mobility, police realized two unsettling facts. Legere was, in fact, for certain in the Miramichi region, and his violence was escalating. In the weeks that followed, tension spiked across the community of Miramichi. and reports emerged, often fragmentary, sometimes contradictory. On May 10th in Chatham, resident Mary Susan Gregan glimpsed a dark figure at her window. She phoned the police, but by the time they arrived, the intruder had vanished. 4 days later, she discovered her jewelry missing, suggesting whoever had peered in that night had returned for more. On May 16th in Chatham, Joe Irving and Kathy McCure saw a man skulking in a nearby field. Joe recognized the silhouette or the manner of movement, and he identified the prowler as Legere. That same day, Michael Sproul of the Kelly Road area, which was close to the Glendenning home, also spotted an unidentified male roaming near residence. Amid this, another unsettling development threatened to muddy the investigative waters. On May 22nd, two brothers, David and John Tanasachuk, escaped from Dorchester Penitentiary. Early on, authorities considered them possible suspects in a crime that had yet to fully unfold, which is the looming tragedy involving Annie Flam. But by the time the Tanasachuk brothers were located in a hunting camp near Harcourt, investigators dismissed them as suspects because they were so disorganized and impulsive that they wouldn't have been capable of the actions that ultimately belonged to Allan Legere. On May 27th, a small but ominous incident occurred. Someone broke into Joe Irving's home. They stole a duffel bag, a pie, and roughly if you're going to steal something, steal the fucking pie.
I mean, I'm there with you.
So a duffel bag, a pie.
You know, I probably wouldn't take a pie because there are so few pies that I actually like. But if there's a cheesecake, all bets are off. It's going with me.
It could be any fruit pie. Everything but apple. A nut pie. I go crazy for a nut pie. Pecan pie, a walnut pie.
I've never even heard of a walnut pie.
It's like a pecan pie.
Well, yeah, but I've never heard of it.
A chocolate pecan pie. And I don't even love chocolate like that.
I like to make a chocolate bourbon pecan pie.
Yeah, so good.
I also make a pecan pie. I make a buttermilk pie.
Okay, I like buttermilk.
And I like chocolate pie.
Coconut cream pie.
Nope.
Yum. The other thing that he stole, and this was such an odd thing to me, was he stole about $100 worth of freezer meat. So I don't know how much $100 Canadian was when it comes to meat in 1987 or 1989, excuse me. But he stole $100 worth of freezer meat. Now, this theft was pretty minor in terms of monetary value, but it's the location that ended up being so critical. Irving lived near Annie Flam's corner store. The pattern had become more clear to law enforcement. Legere was honing in on his next target.
Did they realize that in retrospect or before?
I think more in retrospect because they thought that the brothers might have been involved.
Right.
Also, you're about to see a shift in MO a little bit for Allan Legere.
Okay.
On May 28th, just one day after Joe Irving's home is broken into and $100 of freezer meat is stolen.
That really got you. That freezer meat really got you when this man has been in prison and hasn't had meat. He hasn't really been able to...
What? Okay, well, okay, hold on. Okay, I'm so sorry. Listen, they say $100 of freezer meat, and to me, I'm thinking, ooh, ground beef, some steaks, because I love cows. Yum, yum, cow. But is that what kind of freezer meat you would have in New Brunswick in Canada?
I don't know. I was thinking
Would
moose.
it be like venison?
I was thinking moose.
Caribou?
Moose.
Fish? Because it is in a fishy area.
Fish would be good.
So I don't know. I think that's what really
salmon
takes me out.
Shrimp.
Are there salmon in?
I don't know. I want salmon right now. So
I wonder what percentage of meat consumption in Canada is based on beef. Because when I think meat, I only ever think beef. I don't think anything else. I never want chicken. I hate fish. Turkey is out. Venison, out.
I never really want red meat.
I think I knew that. You're never like, oh, I need a steak.
Never.
May 28th, 1989. Annie Flam was 76 years old, weighing roughly 100 pounds. Frail by most measures. She lived with her sister-in-law, Nina Flam, and they resided just 2 minutes from both the fire station and the local police station, and very close neighbors to Joe Irving. On May 28th, 1989, Annie opened her door to a nightmare. The exact sequence of events remains a mystery, but there are a few facts that are indisputable. Annie was brutally beaten to death. Her home was set on fire in an apparent attempt to destroy evidence and sow terror. Nina was violently assaulted, raped, beaten, and left for dead. There are some sources that suggest that Nina witnessed Annie's murder. Others don't necessarily say that. Nina was conscious through most of the attack on her, and she survived the attack. There are some accounts that say that Nina was maybe attacked first, knocked unconscious, and then remained unaware of the immediate violence that followed against Annie. It is kind of a discrepancy between sources. Nina's survival is attributed in part to her choice not to resist further when Allan Legere tucked her into her bed after both physically and sexually assaulting her. So brutalized her, terrorized her, and then tucked her into bed very tightly like a child. And whether she was feigning compliance or she was too injured to fight back, experts think that this submission is likely what spared her life. As the flames consumed the Flam residence, the community's 911 lines lit up. At around 3:50 a.m., a local named Harry Preston drove past the Flam store on Water Street. He noticed smoke and pulled over. While he was banging on the door, looking for signs of life, police officers Dan Pugh and William Dixon happened to pass by in a patrol car, and they alerted the fire department immediately. Officer Dan Pugh forced his way through the back door, braving the thick smoke. And at the front of the house, he found Nina, barely clothed, in shock, and nearly unconscious from her injuries and the fumes. Wrapping her in his coat, he rushed her out to the waiting paramedics. Fred Petrie, the ambulance driver on the scene, administered critical first aid and oxygen, while Officer Dixon radioed ahead to ensure that a rape kit would be ready upon Nina's arrival to the hospital. At the hospital, Nurse Marjo Palmer and Dr. Gerard Lozier took over Nina's care. And back at the smoldering crime scene, RCMP Constable Kevin Mole arrived to secure the site. And at this point, he and RCMP Staff Sergeant Ben St. Onge took over the larger investigation. And this effectively shifted primary jurisdiction from the smaller Chatham Police to the RCMP. So this is where it kind of leaves local authorities and now is in the hand of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. In the aftermath of this event, the Miramichi region teetered between outrage and utter fear. This was not the reckless work of an unknown suspect. Locals had no doubt who was responsible. Allan Legere, the same man who had brutally attacked John and Mary Glendinning. And they did come to this conclusion rather quickly. I know that we had those two escapee brothers that they initially kind of looked at. Very quickly, it turned to Allan Legere. In the days that followed Annie Flam's murder, Miramichi residents did what they could to cope with the threat that they could neither see nor predict. Beyond the heightened fears on the street, beyond the newly installed locks on doors and windows, one of the mayors of one of those smaller communities, there was a clip of him on a local news station where he talked about how residents were adding additional deadbolts to their doors because there was so much fear around Legere. While that's happening, a new pressing concern surfaced in local journalism. David Cadogan, again, the publisher of the Miramichi Leader, had long maintained a regular column in his own newspaper, and at this point in time, he was using it to speak about Allan Legere extensively. Of course, most of his columns were unkind to Legere. They condemned his crimes, they speculated on the danger of his presence in the Miramichi region, and questioned how could the town protect itself and what was the RCMP doing to protect the town. Some believe that these public condemnations really made Cadogan a prime target, and there were several rumors that Legere was planning to retaliate by striking the people reporting on him, and one of those rumors rose above the rest. Allan Legere burned down Cadogan's home. Now, there is no conclusive proof that this incident occurred, but it is highly possible. And why I say that is because during Suburban Screams, the episode I got the idea for this case from, interviews both Rick McLean and David Cadogan extensively. And David Cadogan does talk about how his home was burned down starting in the master bedroom, but it also sounds like audio that could have been Frankenbiting, where they mash up those different parts. And so it's hard to say if he said exactly exactly that or that was the intention, but that is what we are led to believe, although I couldn't find any other sources that substantiated that. Either way, he was receiving threats. What I do know for certain is that Cadogan's wife grew so terrified by these threats and the constant specter of violence that she ultimately left him, unable to endure the fear that Allan Legere might cause harm to her or her husband. This personal loss, coupled with the possibility of more danger to him, left Cadogan with a sharpened sense that anyone who spoke out against Legere was unsafe. Rick McLean also talks extensively about the terror that he felt and how he realized that there was danger in being vocal. In the aftermath of the rumored fire of Cadogan's or Cadogan's, whatever, of his home,
Shot.
McLean offered a really stark confession, saying, "When the fire happened, I was scared to death. It's like you were in the herd, and the lion was circling around the outside, and you didn't want to be the one that the lion singled out, and it was just a matter of time." In Miramichi, whether spoken aloud or harbored privately, Legere's presence was felt everywhere. In this time period, while McLean and Cadogan continued to report on Legere and even started speaking to national television stations and radio stations, the investigation was still continuing in the background. On May 29th, 1989, the Supreme Court of Canada granted Allan Legere until October 1 to have his appeal heard concerning the Glendinning murder trial. Despite being on the run, Legere did still possess legal avenues to challenge his prior conviction, but nothing came of that. On June 1st, 1989, Joe Irving and his wife spotted a man attempting to break into their garage around 11:30 a.m. Acting on instinct, Joe jumped into his car, gave chase, pursuing the intruder through backyards, driveways, and over fences. And although he never definitively identified the trespasser's face, Irving felt confident that it was Legere. On June 2nd, 1989, local contractor Lloyd Hanna stumbled upon a pair of smoky gray men's eyeglasses at a landscaping site in Chatham. They were lodged in a hole near some freshly stacked lumber, and this site happened to be near the path that Joe Irvin had taken while chasing the suspected intruder. The next day, on June 3rd, 1989, Constable Kevin Mole brought those glasses to an optometrist, and acting Chatham Police Chief Jack Bell later confirmed that these matches not only matched Legere's prescription, but they were also the exact style of frames he'd worn when he escaped from the hospital in Moncton. With each new clue, law enforcement in Miramichi drew a tighter circle around Legere's possible hiding spots. Tension grew, as did the recognition that he was likely staying close to the community he once and was still terrorizing. By mid-June of 1989, Crime Stoppers announced a $2,000 reward for information leading to Legere's arrest. And despite roughly 50 reported sightings ranging from Fredericton to Toronto, investigators remained convinced he was still in the Miramichi area. Constable Kevin Mole, at this time period, had read about the emerging technique of DNA fingerprinting, and he contacted the RCMP crime laboratory in Sackville, hoping to definitively link Legere to recent attacks. Forensic serology expert Sandra Lumgare tested a prison knife used to stab Legere in 1986. I don't know when he was stabbed. I don't know who stabbed him. It sounds like it was in prison, but there was insufficient blood for DNA analysis. A semen swab was tested, and it was unsuitable for profiling. A wart that had been removed from Legere during his incarceration was tested, and ultimately it was deemed unhelpful.
So they just keep anything and everything?
I guess so. But DNA, I mean, if we think about the time period, when was your case solved with DNA? 1987?
Mm-hmm. Colin Pitchford?
Yes. Yeah. Again, still cutting edge. I don't know why they were keeping warts, but... And then a hair sample was also tested from 1986.
But also, he was stabbed, and it seems like they kept that.
Sandra Lumgare also tested a hair sample from 1986, but it was considered inadmissible due to, quote, illegal seizure. Every potential lead hit a dead end, and without conclusive forensic ties, the RCMP had to rely on sightings, statements, and circumstantial evidence to track Legere's movements.
How is DNA going to help them track him?
I don't know.
Okay.
That was information I took from the law library chronology, so...
I mean, I guess you could confirm that he was where they already know that he is.
That he's the perpetrator at these different scenes.
Yeah, but he is...
Because he did sexually assault women at every scene.
Right, but he is an escaped convict, so they don't necessarily need probable cause before they arrest him. They need to locate him to put him back where he belongs.
Yeah. Fast forward to late September of 1989. The sense of dread in Miramichi had not waned. And by the end of September, a fresh wave of violent incidents underscored the possibility that Legere was testing police response times. On September 30th, 1989, Morrissey Doran of Newcastle was shot in the back with a shotgun by an attacker demanding money around 10:30 p.m. Disturbingly, Doran's home lay within a stone's throw of the Newcastle police station. Now, I don't know where this date comes from, and you and I both know that September only has 30 days, but for some reason I have a note that says September 31st, 1989, so I'm just going to go with it for now. So either September 30th or November 1st.
Well, we all know that the final year of a decade is a decade leap.
What does that mean?
It means that September 31st happens every 10 years.
Are you lying?
Yes.
Okay. I was like, how do I not know about this? Edwin, Sonny, Russell, and his wife Evangeline were attacked at approximately 9 p.m. Edwin's and Evangeline's residence was just steps away from the Newcastle police station. As officers responded, they received a separate report. Someone was trying to break into Todd Matchett's father's house 2 miles away. The suspect vanished before authorities arrived. These incidences, compacted into a single 24-hour window, signaled an escalation of violence. Again, many assumed Legere was involved. Miramichi's worst fears crystallized on Friday the 13th, October 1989, when Donna and Linda Donnie, two sisters living a mere minute's walk from the Miramichi leader office.
Donna Donnie?
Mm-hmm. Donna and Linda Donnie.
Don't act like that's a normal name.
Maybe it's Donnie. Daughny. Donne.
I'm not fluent in Canadian.
These two sisters living a mere minute's walk from the Miramichi leader office were found brutally attacked and left in a burning home. Both women were beaten, sexually assaulted, and ultimately murdered. As in the previous crimes linked to Legere, their house was set on fire, and one of the sisters was discovered tucked into bed, a gruesome echo of Nina Flam's ordeal.
And he's actually really pissed that nobody is reporting on what a nice guy he is for tucking these ladies in.
He's so thoughtful, and no one gives a shit. Can you believe it?
Can I believe that? I think that they would probably be more caring if they knew he was recaptured. It's terrifying otherwise. But when he's locked back up, you're like, oh.
I would be in a panic. If there was a serial murderer on the loose in Three Rivers growing up, I would have never wanted to do anything. And I was literally the only person in my family that ever locked a single fucking door.
Well, we already talked about it. There was a serial killer loose in my community when I was a child.
That's true. Rick McLean would later describe the horror upon learning that Linda had actually died from smoke inhalation. Autopsy findings showed a dark line of soot down her trachea, clear evidence that she was alive and breathing as the flames spread.
And she was the one that was tucked in?
Yes,
yeah.
I believe so. Local authorities dispatched over a dozen RCMP officers, but there were no immediate arrests followed. Even though the method and brutality matched Legere's past attacks, the man himself remained elusive. In reconstructing that Friday night, investigators pieced together a kind of tragic timeline. Bernard Geike, who had been neighbors with the Donnies for 33 years, saw the sisters on the morning of October 13th, and Margaret Murray noticed that Donna had been painting her windows in the evening. And around 10 p.m., Faye Hatchie and Linda Donnie left for Tim Horton's coffee.
We're back at Timmy Hort's.
By 10:15 p.m., William White waved at Donna still painting on his way to bed. At 11 p.m., Linda and Faye parted ways after coffee. Margaret Murray, preparing a late meal, saw the Donnies' normally lit back door had gone dark. It was later discovered that the bulb had been partially unscrewed.
That has happened at least 3 times at my garage before. One time it
Here?
was here.
People are unscrewing your light bulb?
I don't know who. I don't know if it is just a matter of time and it kind of works its way loose. But
I've never heard of a light bulb unscrewing itself.
well, but it doesn't have a proper cover around it. Like whatever the thing that covers it is gone and it's just a metal thing. You'll have to look at it when you leave. But one time, this was crazy, but it was right around Halloween. So I wondered if it was my neighbors. They had this really elaborate Halloween setup. And probably was Halloween night, actually, because I clocked that maybe they were doing it so that their decorations were still visible. But I asked my neighbor about it and she said, no, I went to go pick up curbside HEB groceries. The grocery store is about, half a mile from my house.
Right.
By the time I got back, I was not gone 20 minutes. My light bulb was loose again. One time it was while I was out of town for a few days and I came back and it was loose. And then it has happened one other time. But it's not even the light bulb closest to my front door. It's the one in my garage. Like I look at that window at that home across the street and I'm like, is it just directly beaming into there and it's driving somebody crazy? I don't know.
I don't know, but I don't love it.
You think I love it?
I'm sure not.
I'm like, I live alone. I need to not have this be the case.
Sometime after 11:30 p.m., Donna and Linda Donnie were murdered. On the early morning of October 14th, around 3:30 a.m., Terry Mazzaroli drove past the Donnie house and saw lights on, and she noted that this was really unusual for the Donnie household, but didn't really strike immediate alarm. By 5:10 a.m., truck drivers Joseph Wayne Williams and his son Joseph Roderick Williams noticed a man standing near the railway tracks at Mitchell and Jane Streets, roughly 300 yards from the Donnie home and just feet from the fire station. And 20 minutes later, he was still there. 5:45 a.m., Mark Manderson of Bushville also spotted a figure in the same vicinity, though his description differed slightly from the Williamses. By 7:35 a.m., Danny Sullivan, a volunteer firefighter, spotted smoke pouring from the Donnie residence. He raced to the nearby fire hall, alerted his fellow firefighters, and then returned in full gear. Charlie Baxter of the Newcastle Police was only 2 blocks away, and he arrived almost in tandem with Reg Falcom, who entered the burning house with an air pack. Along with James Matheson and Roy Geeky, then retrieved one sister's body, and the second was found tucked into bed by Glenn Tozier and Matheson. At 8:09 a.m., both victims were transported to the Miramichi Hospital, and nurse Joan Paisley stayed with them and noted that she believed that the scene was clearly no accident. And Dr. Basil Blanchard, love that name. I love that it's alliterative.
I was just thinking that I really liked Joan Paisley.
They're all great names. Well, okay, not all of them, but those 2 names are great. He pronounced both sisters dead at 8:10 a.m. And longtime funeral director Brant Adams identified Donna by her heavier build, as the injuries made it impossible to tell them apart otherwise. Upon entering the scorched interior, Constable Kevin Mole remembers immediately suspecting that it was Allan Legere. The pattern, the savage assault, arson, and the chilling final gesture of tucking in the victim mirrored the murder of Annie Flam and Nina Flam. Well, the attempted murder of Nina Flam. As if the Donnie murders weren't devastating enough, the days that followed revealed just how deeply the terror had infiltrated everyday life in Miramichi. On October 16th, Sergeant Arnie Munden convened reporters to share a composite sketch drawn from witness accounts near the railway tracks. Meanwhile, Fred Ferguson, the Crown prosecutor, reported a chilling phone call to his wife. "You're next." Officials canceled Halloween outright, replacing it with small organized parties so children wouldn't venture outdoors after dark. Desperate for any reassurance, citizens looked to public figures for guidance. Edith Russell was one of the few willing to appear on CBC, voicing the fears that many kept private. At the federal level, Liberal MP George Rideout of Moncton demanded additional RCMP support on October 17th. A day later, Crime Stoppers upped the reward to $10,000, hoping that money might succeed where fear had prevailed. Despite the increased police presence, no one seemed to feel any safer. On October 28, 1989, a truck parked outside the Murata Motel was broken into, and the locked storage box was forced open and 2 guns were stolen. Shortly after midnight, John McLean, not Rick McLean, John McLean, of the Tweedy Street discovered a tall, slim man lurking in his yard. Then he noticed his car and truck windows had been smashed. Corporal Gayton Thomason and his police dog Sam, love Sam, arrived to track the suspect. They sprinted through backyards, leapt fences in pursuit, and at one point, Corporal Thomason fell 30 feet. Gunshots rang out, though accounts differ on who fired, and Sam briefly slipped his handler's grip, nearly closing in on the fleeing figure before being called back. By 2 a.m., additional RCMP reinforcements had arrived, evacuating nearby homes. Dawn brought fresh reports of break-ins, missing food, and more sightings of a mysterious man in the vicinity of the local golf course. Throughout this escalating crisis, Rick McLean grew vocal about the RCMP's tight-lipped approach. He openly complained that law enforcement withheld vital details from the public, details that might help residents protect themselves. However, RCMP Superintendent Al Rivard urged caution, asking for media cooperation so as to not compromise ongoing operations. He confirmed that Sergeant Ernie Munden would respond to calls but refrained from appearing on camera, while a specialized unit dedicated to finding Legere was being formed.
It's crazy to think that he is doing such a bang-up job of tracking people down, but nobody, even though all of the collective people are trying to track him down, he's doing a better job at tracking people down than they are the reverse.
Right. Still, McLean believed more transparency could prevent panic. The RCMP believed that too much information might aid Legere, who was known to monitor radio broadcasts. The divide between local reporters and law enforcement underscored the complexity of tracking this cunning fugitive in this close-knit community. As tensions rose between the press and law enforcement, one journalist fears would soon become painfully personal. Through autumn 1989, the Miramichi leader-editor Rick McLean found himself on television and radio more than ever. He recounted Legere's history, the ongoing manhunt, and the toll it took on the community. I want you to remember that this is the same Rick McLean who once warned his wife that if Legere ever escaped, they might have to flee. Now, with the fugitive at large, his high-profile coverage made him a prime target. His wife grew increasingly uncomfortable. She saw how media attention placed a virtual target on her husband's back. If Legere was singling out vocal critics, McLean's high profile surely drew the fugitive's notice.
Was this not the woman who left her husband?
That was Cadogan.
Man, this guy really was wreaking havoc on all sorts of relationships.
He was fucking up some marriages, wasn't he?
Yeah.
I want to point out that the Miramichi leader was staffed with 4 people. It was McLean, who was also the editor, his wife, another reporter named Bonnie Sweeney, and a 4th person. I don't know who, but I don't think it was Cadogan. That 4th person's name is never mentioned. I just know it was a 4-person newsroom. October 28th, 1989. Chaos swept through Chatham. A frantic pursuit played out in real time, with residents tuning to police scanners for updates. Officers cornered a shotgun-wielding suspect and ordered him to surrender. When he spun around, they recognized Allan Legere. Calm, cold, lethal. Witnesses recalled him saying, "If you don't leave me alone, I'm going to fucking kill you." A single shot rang out, and before authorities could close in, Legere vanished into the darkness again. The authorities literally had him cornered, and him turning around, firing the shotgun, and saying, "I'll fucking kill you," led to him escaping again. The RCMP issued a brief news release confirming that a shot had been fired, but giving no further details. Local TV reports were scathing, declaring that Legere had outfoxed his pursuers and that the Mounties had effectively cried uncle. Furious residents demanded better communication, but law enforcement kept their updates sparse. Rick McLean was so frustrated by this incident that he made a bold editorial move. McLean wrote an editorial unlike one he had ever penned before, and different than any editorial he would ever write again. And he placed it squarely on the front page of the Miramichi Leader. He opened with the following lines attributed to John Donne.
The poet?
Yes. "Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee." McLean then went on to lambast authorities for asking citizens to help, yet providing no actionable information in return. What can we do with no information, no insight, nothing that helps us with our desire to ensure our own personal safety? McLean had hoped that his words would spur the RCMP to share more. McLean had broken norms of local journalism, and the reaction was pretty immediate. Readers applauded his candor, and others worried that such a provocation might push Legere to retaliate. At this time, McLean was unaware of the DNA and the boxed-in tip that were about to surface, and Miramichi's anxieties were reaching a tipping point. By November 13th, 1989, Andre Vinoy of the CBC TV reported that DNA lab tests had matched evidence from previous crime scenes to Allan Legere. It was a major step toward conclusive identification, though Legere remained at large. 2 days later, on November 15th, 1989, local police arrested Allard Joseph Vinu of Newcastle, charging him with the earlier attacks on Morrissey Doran and Sonny Russell. And this development really clarified that Legere might not have committed those specific shotgun assaults. However, because of the public discourse, the public believed that every violent act was and should be attributed to Legere. So again, we're having this intersection of criminals, and because of reporting, crimes are being attributed to someone who did not commit them, which also complicates finding a criminal.
I'm not really sure that I'm understanding 100% the relationship between the Mounties and the media.
I think that the local media and the local population wanted more information from the RCMP. They were very tight-lipped about revealing any details, and it seemed that they felt that it was leaving them in a position of weakness, of almost being disenfranchised from protecting themselves because they didn't know enough.
Yeah, and we talked about that when we covered the Grim Sleeper, the choice to not tell the people about 11 or 13 murders that were not reported to the public, and they weren't told, hey, these are the areas that we suspect a serial killer is operating in. Hey, make sure you're not getting in cars with anybody that you are not familiar with. So I can appreciate that take, because I also agreed that the right choice was not say something.
Right.
But it seems that the media is maybe being almost irresponsible by reporting the limited information that they have in the way that they are reporting it, by making it seem absolute that it should be attributed to Legere, which opens up the possibility for other criminals to act with reckless abandon, even more so than people who commit crimes might, and almost creating a sense of safety or comfort around people that they should be leery of. By saying that all of the violent crime that's taking place here can be attributed to one person.
Right.
When that's not the case.
You know, I'm glad you brought that up, because it kind of takes me back to us getting in the time machine and visiting the question of how do the citizens of a small community in rural New Brunswick get their news? And I think that part of that, again, we hear reports that average citizens are listening into police scanners, hoping to get information. And it brings me to this idea of the media may have acted irresponsibly, but we also know that in smaller communities, communicating information quickly becomes communicating rumors, communicating misinformation. And I think that that has to play a role here. Right.
Where did this idea that it was all one person come from?
I think that that's in the vein of what I was just talking about. You're in a small community. You know this one particular person who has this terrible reputation, who's committed a previous crime. And now you're seeing a man that's similar in stature committing crimes. You're finding him running about stealing from you. I think it's just an easy thing for people to assign to another person. I don't want to say that it was the Miramichi leader that said that he did these things. I think that could have been communicated person to person.
Yeah.
You know, I call up my friend Bev and say, hey, Allan Legere was in my yard, or I think it was Allan Legere. And then Bev calls Cindy and she's like, oh my God, so-and-so was attacked by Allan Legere.
Right. I understand how all of that works. Right. I guess from what you were saying, what I understood is that this idea that it was just one person committing all of the bad things in the community, that that was coming from the media.
Cadogan and McLean both talk about how they pretty consistently wrote about Legere and his crimes. So you are right in that aspect, but I cannot say that they were writing falsehoods in that paper. I don't know that.
Right.
My storytelling has been too strong and active. I've led you down a path that I carefully curated for you, and now you feel this way.
Are you mocking me?
A little bit, but not like intentionally. I feel like what I said to you, what I have read aloud to you, has made you think that the Miramichi leader and its people, its reporters, were untrustworthy.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that it sounds like because they were working with such limited information.
Right.
So it sounds like the media and the Mounties were not collaborating with information. And so because they were using such a limited amount of information, there was a lot of room for interpretation on the reader's part.
Sure. Yeah, I can see that.
That maybe made readers think that only one person could be responsible for all of the bad things, which just feels irresponsible to me.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that they're not trustworthy. I think that they're working with what they have, which is kind of a tightrope walk.
Yeah.
Because if you say something that ends up not being true, which nobody is saying that they did, I understand that. But if you're operating with very limited information, if you do, then that's misleading and dangerous for people who are consuming your information.
Yeah. That evening, Father James Smith, a Roman Catholic priest, was due to celebrate Mass. According to a detailed timeline, at 2:30 p.m., Father Smith left the Renouse Recreation Center, heading to the Miramichi Hospital in Newcastle. He was at the hospital until 5 p.m. At 5:30 p.m., a local high school student, Peter McCafferty, delivered an envelope to Father Smith's home. The priest seemed relaxed, was eating a meal, and then around 9 p.m., Anna May Chevary saw Father Smith outside on his patio, glancing around as if he heard a noise. Sometime after that sighting, Father Smith was brutally murdered. Later reports from the crime scene described a floor covered in blood, spatter on the ceiling, and catastrophic injuries. Multiple witnesses recounted that Legere, and I don't know if they knew immediately that it was Legere, but I'm just telling you from the perspective that I have, that Father Smith's face had been essentially disconnected from his head, and it was sliding off of his head like it were a mask, which is interesting to me because we haven't seen Legere commit a murder in this pattern, in this way.
Mm-hmm.
The brutal beating, absolutely. And so it led me to questions like, well, how did Father Smith being a male potentially affect the way Legere approached this instance? I don't know where the slicing his face off of his head came from. Do you have any thoughts?
Sounds very Ed Gein to me, but other than that, no.
Okay. There are a few different references which lead to some discrepancy about when Father Smith was discovered, but we do know that it was that night that he was murdered. By 6 p.m. the next day, November 16th, the RCMP publicly confirmed DNA testing had tied Allan Legere to the murders. Yet Rick McLean and Andre Vanoit broke the news in advance, scooping the formal announcement. Meanwhile, investigators combing Father Smith's rectory realized the killer had spent time there. He had eaten food from the kitchen, washed his boots and placed bread bags over his feet to keep them dry, changed into fresh clothes, stashed bloody garments in a bag, answered at least one phone call telling the caller wrong number, and hotwired Father Smith's 1984 Oldsmobile Delta 88 and drove away.
Could he not find the keys?
I don't know.
I mean, okay.
Hours later, around 7:45 p.m. the next day, local sightings in Bathurst suggested that Legere had fled north, and the battered Oldsmobile turned up near a train station with the steering column ripped out, an envelope labeled J. Smith, Chatham Headley inside, and by the time the Bathurst police arrived, Legere was gone. Early on November 17th, plainclothes officer Constable Regis Cote, Corporal Richard Paul, and Constable Francois Gaillant boarded a 9-car train at Rivière de Loup, Quebec, hunting for a heavy-set man with dark hair and tattoos on his right forearm. In dim corridors, they quietly roused passengers and checked ID. One man, passenger number 30, seemed a partial match until he turned out to be Fernand Savoy of Boctouche, with no tattoos on his right arm. These French names really take me out. Only later did police confirm the original bulletin contained an error. Legere's eagle head tattoo was on his left forearm, not his right. And this blunder allowed him to slip away once again. Fernand Savoy was actually Allan Legere. And because the tattoo wasn't in the right place.
That is absurd to me. I think if you're looking for an eagle, is that what you said?
Yeah.
An eagle forearm tattoo on the left arm and you find one on the right arm, you double check. You say, hey, double check this. How do we know? That is, I'm just going to say. It's stupid.
Cameron, that was not a part of the fucking video. That was something I found while I was cross-checking. And I was like, what do you mean? What do you mean that this is what happened?
Well, we know exactly what music would be dubbed under that scene if it was on Drag Race.
Again, as fear increased, Premier Frank McKenna returned to be with his people, and the Crime Stoppers reward surged to $50,000. Meanwhile, local police realized that a rumored second suspect was really just Legere himself, just drastically thinner after months of living off the land.
Call the prison. Hey, which arm is the tattoo on? Stage right? Or, I mean, they've got warts that they removed off the man years ago. They're going to know which arm the tattoo... This isn't... Maybe if they had shared information with the media would have reported which arm the tattoo was on and they would have had it right.
So, in Montreal, a man using the name Fernand Savoy checked into the Queen Elizabeth Hotel near the train station on November 17th, 1989. Sometimes, checking in daily, Rosalind Antoine, a longtime hotel employee, remembered Fernand rarely leaving his room. During his stay, he visited an optometrist for new glasses, and Morley Thompson and William Hextall, local pawn shop owners, and bought jewelry from him. They bought diamond rings, a box link chain, pendants, and items with distinctive stones, likely all stolen. Authorities were also fielding multiple false alarms. Near Newcastle, someone spotted a man with a gun and a knife strapped to his leg. Police rushed in only to find a legitimate hunter of rabbits. On November 23rd at 11 a.m., Jane Meredith unlocked the door to the Piper's Club of Prince William Street in St. John. A man in a heavy parka and boots waited outside. He remained until 9:45 p.m., leaving behind a 20-page handwritten letter on the table. Staff never saw him sign it, but it's suspected to have been Legere. Later that night, Ron Gomke, a St. John taxi driver, picked up a man wanting to travel the 110 miles to Moncton, the first hospital location that Legere escaped from. Dispatch quoted a $100 fare. Midway there, the passenger produced a sawed-off, what are they called, the .308 rifle?
I don't know guns.
Okay, well, I have to look it up. A .308 Winchester rifle. The passenger told the taxi cab driver, "Tell them you have the fare. I'm the one they're looking for. I'm Allan Legere." Snow blew across the highway as they inched along. Forced to keep driving, the car eventually spun out near Moncton, lodging into a snow bank. Legere hid the gun, flagged down a second car, and unwittingly encountered Constable Michelle Mercer, an off-duty RCMP officer. She offered assistance, but soon found herself taken hostage alongside Gomke.
You done fucked up now.
Legere's moods swung wildly as he chain-smoked and proposed outlandish ideas. Constable Mercer stayed calm, even suggesting he hijack a plane if he wanted to flee the country. I love that. I love that the ideas that she presents to him are so outlandish. When they reached Sussex, she convinced him they needed gas, hoping for an escape window. At the Four Corners Irving station, Legere forced Mercer's keys and money from her, and then went inside to pay. She and Gomke seized the opportunity, starting the car and racing off to alert local RCMP. By the time police arrived, Legere was gone again. Leaving Sussex, Legere targeted Brian Golding at an Irving truck stop. Golding was en route from Montreal to Halifax, and Legere introduced himself at gunpoint, saying, "I'm Allan Legere and we're leaving." He demanded they go to Moncton, but they soon passed the city. And around 5 a.m., nearing Rogersville, Legere dozed. He wanted to reach CFB Chatham by 6 a.m. for a commercial flight, but he didn't want to get there early. Golding suggested dropping the trailer for easier travel, and Legere agreed, only to change his mind again, ordering Golding onto Route 118, a side road hugging the Miramichi River. I want to let you know, trucks did not travel along Route 118. It was almost like a service road. It was not a road for long-haul truckers to use. And residents who lived along this road ended up calling a local authority saying, hey, it's really weird that we have a truck going down our road. That's not right. That doesn't happen. Additionally, a second trucker also thought this was really strange when he saw it happen, and he alerted police via his CB radio. RCMP Corporal Terry Barter and Corporal Gary Lutwick organized a roadblock very quickly, and when they spotted the truck's headlights, they activated their own. And this moment, Golding had asked Legere what he wanted him to do, and Legere said, keep driving. For half an hour, the rig rumbled along as the police followed. Finally, Golding declared he couldn't keep going. He stopped, jumped out shouting, it's him, he has a gun. Succinct, accurate.
Very to the point.
Yes. If I were jumping out of the truck with a murder, I probably wouldn't have words at all. Barter pulled Golding aside. Lutwick aimed an M16 at the cab, demanding the driver exit with hands visible. Legere threw out a sawed-off shotgun, still cocked with a single bullet. I'm all right, I'm okay, you've got me. Legere dropped to the ground and tensed his arms as if to resist. Then Barter kicked him in the cheek, ordering him to stay down. Additional RCMP arrived, placing leg shackles on Legere, and at 5:45 a.m., Legere was secured at the Newcastle RCMP station. After months of mayhem and at least 4 murders, he was finally back in custody. McLean, hearing this news, sped to the Leader office. Cadogan really wanted to get direct coverage, but McLean remembers cutting him off, and this might give a little credence to your argument that you were making earlier. McLean is quoted as saying to Cadogan, we need a special edition, to which Cadogan responded, fuck yes. So Cadogan was very motivated to sell as many copies of the paper as possible. He did push McLean to look for stories that would drive sales. And I didn't mention it in the text earlier, but one of the things that Cadogan and McLean do acknowledge is that they were thrilled that they were outselling the New York Times for coverage like this. Like, it was brought up multiple times.
Good on them.
McLean also took a lot of pride during his coverage of Legere. He spoke about how he had stopped at a gas station that was only 400 yards away from the printing house that did their paper, and that it had become routine for like 120, 130, 140 people to be waiting in their cars every night for the paper to be delivered so they could know the newest updates about Legere. Within hours, Miramichi residents rejoiced. They poured into the streets, and this is how it's described. Church bells tolled in celebration, and a special mass was convened, and it was labeled the Liberation of the Miramichi. That same day, the mayor spoke on live news, marveling at how relief replaced terror almost overnight. Legere now faced 4 counts of first-degree murder. Under Canadian law, parole eligibility on these new charges would be 25 years, longer than the 18-year possibility from the earlier Glendenning case. I believe I misquoted and said 12 earlier, but it's 18. Skepticism lingered. Many, including Cadogan, feared Legere might escape again. After all, he had already done so. Shortly after returning to prison, Legere allegedly made fresh escape plans, intensifying the community's anxieties. Rick McLean recalled receiving a hysterical phone call from his wife, home alone with their 1-year-old daughter. She had just opened a letter that read, "Hi dear, how are you? I had such a nice time last summer. Seen your nice place. You are such a lovely wife, and I love the new babby. So quiet and bouncy. I know you spend a lot of time by yourself, so I know you won't mind me visiting you next year. Until then, I'll say I'll see you again. Love, Nick." Authorities were able to confirm that this handwriting belonged to Allan Legere, but how the letter got to them is less certain. What is believed to have happened is that Legere's girlfriend came to visit him, and she smuggled the letter out and sent it via Canadian Post, which does make sense because it was like a known practice. It was something that happened frequently enough that Canadian authorities were like, yeah, people do sneak out letters and mail them off on the inmate's behalf.
Why this person? Why? Because I know that it was a different time and that there was more stock that was put into handwriting analysis, but it is now considered kind of a junk science. So
the letter was also postmarked from the city that Legere's girlfriend lived in.
Yeah, I don't think she was the only resident, though. Where did this come from? Why did they even ever suspect that it was from him?
So from my understanding,
it feels random to me.
I think this was a practice he had done before.
Okay.
I think he had left letters for people before. I think he'd sent letters before. I think that
the misspelling of baby was common.
Yes. Also, the Love Nick, which, as you know, like Nick Scratch, the devil. I think that
I don't know. I know Saint Nick.
Okay. Well, like Nick Scratch is a reference to the devil. It's supposed to be the devil's name. And I think that was something that Legere really liked. Like it was known that he liked being referred to as Nick. So can I tell you the exact thinking behind all of this? No. I'm just reporting to you what I saw and read.
Reporting?
Yes. Live.
A trusted media source.
Who does his due diligence in every aspect and fact checks every little thing. Legere's first parole hearing on these charges, so we're talking now years in the future. I believe his first parole hearing was sometime in the 20-teens. His first parole hearing on these charges dragged on for, I believe, 2 hours.
Am I to understand that he's eligible for parole for release?
Yes.
So he's been serving all of these sentences concurrently?
I guess so.
And we allow violent murderers who escape prison and go on a murder rampage to qualify for parole. I
don't know enough about the Canadian justice system. But I do know of that 2-hour hearing, Legere spent 40 minutes of his time talking about Rick McLean, suggesting a deep personal vendetta, which was one of the deciding factors in why he was not granted parole.
Yeah, no shit. He shouldn't be allowed parole. I think if you're locked up for murder, I don't care what country it's in, you're locked up for murder, you escape and go and murder how many people?
4.
4 people. You terrorize a community. You injure.
You assault more people than you manage to murder.
Right. We've got arson. We've got so much crime on the table. I
don't understand the Canadian justice system.
Well, you're going to have to learn because this guy's about to be your neighbor.
I guess that's fair. I do know that in another parole hearing, they pointed to how he escaped the first time, showing that he was never really committed to any kind of rehabilitation. Yes. One of the things that McLean talks about is how he approached major Legere updates. And when Legere escaped in May of 1989, McLean used the front page to post an enormous photo of Legere. That was the entire front page with the single word escaped. And when Legere was apprehended, he ran the same photo with the headline caught. And when Legere was found guilty, he reran that same photo with the word guilty. And to paraphrase McLean, I'm waiting for the same picture to be run one last time under the word dead.
Yeah. Deceased.
There are additional details that we don't necessarily need to get totally into. Finding a jury for the trial proved exceedingly difficult because news coverage had been so vast. And from my understanding, they had interviewed 32 different jurors. None of them were eligible based on how they answered questions. They were able to get 1 to 2 jurors, and then they used those jurors to help them determine if other jurors would be impartial. So it was a very complicated jury to assemble, but eventually they did make it worse.
Worse?
I mean, they did make it work. Sorry. Between December 22nd, 1990 and early 1991, Legere staged a hunger strike, calling his judge biased. He also tried to have a book banned called Terror, Murder, and Panic in New Brunswick, written by Rick McLean and Andre Vinoy, on the grounds that it could prejudice a jury. And in a 2-1 appellate decision, the book was banned, but it had already been widely circulated. Also, the venue for the murder trial was Oromocto High School. So a high school was used as the venue for this high-profile murder trial. And they ended up interviewing more than 510 jurors. The case had 243 witnesses. Anyway, those are just some extra details that I thought were interesting. So additionally, Legere's first eligibility for day parole, so I guess to be out during the day,
day pass,
was November 2012, and full parole eligibility started in November 2015. And the residents of Miramichi were not having that.
Right.
The family spoke out. Community members spoke out about the terrifying months of 1989 and the continuing trauma. The mayor and the community members penned several letters urging the board to keep Legere behind bars. Ultimately, Legere waived his right to a parole hearing in 2015, and then he was transferred to the Quebec Super Maximum Prison to the Edmonton Institution in Alberta, although the reasons for this move have been kept confidential, citing inmate privacy rights. In May 2019, guards discovered a weapon hidden inside of Legere's TV within his cell, another echo of his 1989 break where he concealed tools via TV antenna in his rectum.
He had a TV in his cell?
Yeah.
That he could access?
That's what it says.
It wasn't behind bars or plexiglass.
Well, remember, he had been moved from a super maximum prison to the Edmonton Institution in Alberta, so maybe that was less restrictive.
It was all a stupid decision. I think if you...
I know I'm going to agree with you, so I'm ready to hear it.
I think if you escape prison and then you go on, because really and truly, this guy was difficult to find and he was quite active. If he had just decided to lay low and not go on some murderous arsonist rampage, I was going to say arsenic, but that's different. I think that we throw the key away once we get you back in custody.
Throw away the key. Throw away everything.
You've lost your eligibility for parole. Don't you think that that's more of a deterrent when we're talking about trying to escape prison? It's crazy to think that this guy got out because this guy was violent for what reason? I don't know. He was like, I hate being in prison. I can't just go beat people to death when I'm in prison. So let me get out of prison so I can go beat people to death.
I can't sexually assault women while I'm in prison.
And I am sorry if I'm too American right now, but like this person is not able to be rehabilitated.
You know, you and I hold some really, really complicated feelings around America and around the American justice system, but I'll be damned if we don't both like a little bit more punishment than a life sentence with day parole eligibility in less than 25 years and full parole eligibility in 25.
Especially when somebody is this violent.
Right.
For what reason?
Right.
Because it feels like he was doing it to get back at the community, to get back at the people in that community that didn't like him or who reported negatively about him. This is baffling to me that this is somebody that any judicial system would consider allowing, because the resources that go into the filing for parole or the appellate courts, all of that, it's just a waste of resources and time and breath as far as I'm concerned. But it feels like they're like, let's actually consider it. No.
Then you're going to love the next part I have.
Is he out? Is that what you're about to tell me? That they were like, yes, put him on the streets.
So in addition to finding the weapon, there were also multiple file reports indicating that he had displayed fixations on certain female staff members.
Fixations. He tucks weapons away while he's incarcerated. This guy has no business being out.
He would send these female officers poetry and unsolicited notes, and psychological evaluations repeatedly concluded that he remained a violent, untreated sex offender,
Right.
further cementing the case against Parole.
I'm a baby as far as these types of assessments go. Have I got a master's degree where that was part of what I had to do? Yes. But I don't know that I needed to sit this guy down and do the formal evaluation to come to the same conclusion. This guy does not belong out on the streets. You're about to tell me that he's been released. I can feel it.
Legere's next major parole hearing took place on January 13th, 2021.
Because there's no way that you would have included that information about the psychological assessments and the inflection you used. You're about to tell me that he's out.
This hearing was done via video from the Edmonton institution. By then, Legere was nearly 73 years old.
Don't care. Still violent.
Despite his advanced age, the Parole Board of Canada heard testimony from prison officials who stated that Legere's risk to the community remained high.
Yep.
A parole officer testified that he still demonstrated limited insight into his crimes and refused to accept responsibility for certain murders. He was also on a waiting list for a high-intensity sex offender program. During the hearing, Legere reportedly claimed he was a different man.
No, tuck him into his cell and we leave him there.
Yet he openly questioned why the community couldn't just, and I quote, forgive and forget.
Okay, but here I'm going to counter that he can just shut the fuck up.
And die in prison.
Right.
Which might be better than what he deserves.
Yes. I said tuck him into bed. I didn't even say light the cell on fire. Just tuck him in.
In particular, Legere denied having murdered 2 of his 4 victims, insisting there had been an accomplice.
No.
However, the board noted that DNA evidence, one of the first times such evidence was used to convict rather than exonerate, proved his presence at the crime scene beyond a doubt.
In Canada, I assume.
I guess.
Okay.
The board pressed him on whether he considered himself a violent person or a sex offender. Legere answered no to both questions.
Right, which means he's exactly where he deserves to be. He belongs right where he is.
Here is the official decision of the parole board. Legere remains an untreated sexual offender and violent offender, representing an ongoing public safety risk. Again, the application for day and full parole was denied, so he is still in prison. For the families who lost loved ones, including Mary Glendenning, relatives of Annie Flam, of the Donnie sisters, of Father James Smith, this repeated parole process reopens decades of trauma. They must choose whether to submit updated victim impact statements, forcing them to relive the terror for a formal hearing that many believed should never be necessary again. Interviews with local citizens, including longtime residents who remember the monster of the Miramichi manhunt, reveal a steadfast refusal to let him return. Many recall sleeping with guns nearby, installing extra lights around their homes,
Very American.
which they refer to as Legere lights, or uprooting entirely until Legere was caught. And elderly people moved in with younger family members, and several families just moved out of the Miramichi area altogether. These emotional scars still linger, some including those who faced direct threats or received ominous letters, and continue to fear that he may once again find a path to freedom.
That's the other thing. Do away with any possibility of him getting out because of all of the people who were traumatized by his escape and all of the horrendous acts that he committed during that escape. They are being re-traumatized every time he is up for parole again, or files for parole again, or is heard for possible release.
It is his right to have his case reevaluated for parole every 2 years.
Every 2 years.
Now, I don't know if it's happening that frequently. The information kind of dies off after that. Either way, you're absolutely right. The families of these victims and some of the victims themselves are re-traumatized by every instance of these hearings, of these renewed parole attempts. I hope soon that they are able to live in peace and not have to worry about updating a victim impact statement or thinking about Allan Legere again.
You're waiting for McLean's final image.
He's no longer the editor of any papers. He's retired. But he does say that's his wish, that once again he'll see the Miramichi leader post that picture.
This guy sucks.
He sucks bad. And it wasn't like he wasn't even necessarily good at getting away with the crimes.
Mm-mm.
He wasn't particularly skilled in moving from one place to another, but it was like stumble after fuck up after fortuitous opportunity that led him to getting away with all of these crimes back to back to back.
I also think sometimes disorganized criminals who are on the run are harder to figure out where they're going to be. And he feels very disorganized, even though he does fixate and kind of target specific people. You never know when he's going to target or if he's going to show up at this other house and randomly kill these people before going back into his targeting. It doesn't feel organized.
How do you predict the pattern for a disorganized criminal?
Right.
How do you say when they're going to strike again or where they're going to strike? And while he did stay in the Miramichi area for a considerable amount of time, we know that he traveled back and forth to Montreal at least once, sold jewelry there, used his alias to navigate, was able to get fucking new glasses.
Well, he was also able to look these people who were searching for him in the face and be like,
Not me, Mr.
Savoy.
Savoy. Yeah. When I first consumed the episode of Suburban Screams, it was truly a very dramatized version that had kind of an excessive emotional force behind it. But when you read the evidence and the accounts that ran concurrent with the storytelling of the episode, they do a good job of capturing the terror. They really do, because these citizens of Miramichi were frightened. They installing additional deadbolts, putting up Legere light poles, putting in family members to live with younger family members, trying to retreat from the wooded areas. I didn't mention it earlier in the case, but kind of the saving grace of finding and finally catching him is that with the first snow of the season, which happened in late October, they were able to say, okay, he can't get rid of evidence of snow prints. He's not going to be able to continue to move in these forested areas unfound, unnoticed. And so that's when they think he was kind of driven to move into more of that space of going to Montreal and staying in that hotel, because he was getting by using these improved makeshift shelters and teepees. And teepee is not the word I used. That is the word that came from my source.
No, you use improved.
Improv, makeshift,
improvised
shelters, improvised, improv, whatever. It's all the same. You know what I meant. Can you not just shorten the word improvised to improved?
Well, improv, I think, is a type of...
What, is that just a noun?
I think so. Because it's the type of comedy,
entertainment,
right?
Well, now I need to know for sure.
School me, honestly. Tell me I'm wrong. Not enough people do.
Okay. Well, I give it up to you. You're correct. Improved is not a word.
Improvised is.
Yes.
I understand why you were like, I'm over this.
Mm-hmm. I think I said that to you.
He sucks, and then they dropped the ball so many times. And it's like, y'all suck too. Why does everybody suck?
The first time he escaped, I was like, fuck this. What do you mean? He turned around and said, I'll kill you, and then got away. Like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
And that's when I was done.
Yeah. And then you're like, oh, well, they came face to face with him on the train, but they had the wrong arm. So they...
Which, again, can you believe that the alias and the train bit was not included in the video episode? I was like, out of all the shit you decided to include, you didn't include that he evaded authorities again?
Wait, this reminds me of a case that I covered where I was like, this information was not included, which is bonkers, because it's definitely something that should have been included in this specific coverage of this.
Right. And the episode talks nothing about DNA, which it ended up being a huge case for DNA in Canada.
Yeah, the first one that they solved.
That they used for conviction versus
exoneration.
Yeah. I'm like, what do you fucking mean? You had to sit here and tell me all this dumb bullshit. You couldn't tell me about this. But of course, I know it's stylized. It's meant to sell a story. I mean, it's literally John Carpenter's Suburban Screams.
Well, and also, just like you were kind of over the case when you were writing it, and I'm kind of over the case once we got to about the same point where it's like, okay, now we're just endangering people. We're just allowing this. Yeah, they're probably over it too. They were like, this fucking guy.
Yeah, that's the story of the monster of the Miramichi.
Well, I hope he never gets out.
Same.
My heart goes out to Miramichi every time he is up for parole. And I guess hopefully the system does what it's supposed to do and keeps him in.
Maybe one day Miramichi will know uninterrupted peace, at least related to Allan Legere.
Here's the hoping. Thank you for telling me this. I'm glad you supplemented information that was glossed over, skipped entirely from...
Just omitted.
Yeah, it's going to drive me crazy trying to figure out which case I covered that they did that.
I have to really shout out the University of New Brunswick's law library, because that official time chronology where they documented from his escape to his last trial was so incredibly helpful. It kind of cut through the noise of like sensationalized coverage, through the additional riffraff of some articles and editorials, and really created this kind of very factual, very succinct timeline. And that really helped me stay on track in telling this story. So if every university could just create chronologies like that of every crime, I would be so thankful and grateful. So get on it.
Yes.
For no other reason than to help me make this podcast.
Yeah. I noticed that you did not say, I'm going to go to school so that I can help research this and make sure that it's happening. You're just going to give the directive.
Yeah, I think I'm done with school.
I just hated this guy. And so I kind of hate the case.
That's fair.
Not your coverage of it, but the whole thing sucked. The way it was handled.
Yeah.
The fact that he is still eligible for parole, like sitting here right now, February 16th, 2025.
It is truly so wild.
A complete list of sources and any links can be found in the show notes.
And that's all we've got for this episode. If you enjoyed listening and you want to hear more, subscribe, give us a 5-star rating, and leave a review.
Make sure that you recommend us to a friend.
And make sure you're following us at End of Crime Pod on Instagram. Right now, you're only getting half the story.
Our email address is endofcrimepod@gmail.com, so feel free to reach out with questions or episode suggestions.
Thank you for listening.
Until the next crime.